We will now welcome Gianna Ledermann in her second year PhD. She's at the Laboratory of Media Design, and she will be presenting her work on making space for subsistence, living and working in agrarian households.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for the organization today for this event. My name is Gianna, and as already said, I will talk about subsistence as well, but in a bit different terms. And I would like to start showing this graph, which shows tendencies in agriculture. So we had on the top, we have a strong multifunctionality, which means like a lot of mixed use spaces and non-productivist spaces, which means not only spaces, but like agriculture, with a high orientation towards subsistence. And on the lower, we have a weak multifunctionality, which is normally the productivist part of agriculture, which is characterized by monocultures, and which can be called industrial or entrepreneurial farming style, compared to the upwards, which can be described as a peasant farming style. And why I show this graph is because I want to insist that history is not linear, and there is not really a development towards one side of agriculture, but there is kind of like an up and down. So we have in different histories, or like in different periods, different tendencies where certain things get stronger. And that's also why, or like, that's a reason why I feel the part where we see here, I mean, a part of the, I don't know if you see, no. On the right side, we see it's a future projection. So we have a part that is maybe future non-productivist tendencies, and we have this growing part of, again, like the peasant orientation, which I find quite interesting, and I would like to investigate in this part. And as I work on Switzerland, I start the frame from 1850 to up to today. The Swiss agriculture, the Swiss Rural Archives calls this the agrarian industrial period, and later from the 50s on, the industrial agrarian period. And in this research, I want to do a descriptive research proposed by different mixed methods, which is on the one side a historical research, mostly based on these materials from the rural archives in Bern, and on this, at the same time, an immersion into contemporary peasant farming practices, where I work with field journal, I work on the farms, and I discuss a lot with the people on the fields there about the work, and they influence the work strongly. This is also said about my personal background. I come from, I grew up on a farm led by several families as a collective, and so I am biased in this work. And for this presentation, I would introduce three notions, which is the peasantry or peasant agriculture, the household, and the subsistence. And this is just like an overview to see a bit in the time. We have on the upside, we have tendencies of like visibility. I call it for the moment visibility, because I think it's mostly about being seen in the society and in the spaces, towards on the downside, like an invisibility of things. So to start with the first one, about the definition of peasantry, it changed over time, and there is many complex literature about it. I want to quickly introduce what characteristics it has. It's mostly the family farm as the basic unit of a multidimensional social organization. That means it doesn't necessarily have to be a family, but it's a farm. So the entity is a farm. Then land husbandry as the main means of livelihood, directly providing the major part of the consumption needs. So we have a lot of on-farm subsistence, and we work directly with the land. And a specific traditional culture related to the way of life of small rural communities, which is a lot about the entanglements and the relation to the territories. And as a fourth point, what they call a multi-directional subjection to powerful outsiders, which means in this case the state, or kind of like pressure from the market. So just like going through, there is, as you see, many different notions of this term. We could also even say that permaculture has a kind of like relation to this term, or going further, also agroecology feeds into that. That's just to show a big overview how this term englobes various levels and scales, from the social to the farming to the community, and the spatial. And lately, I also want to say that peasant today is a proud self-designation. And this goes also back to a lot of the contemporary organizations, such as the Confédération Paysanne in France or Unitaire in Switzerland, or Bien Campesina, that are kind of reuniting these different peasantries around the world. And then in recent decades, the gender perspective within this peasantry notion was becoming more important. And I will not talk about this today, but it's just like a part of my research is also interested in the spaces of the paysan, which is in French the word for a female farmer, because in English we don't have a correct word. So I will call them paysan. And starting from that, I want to talk about the household as in relation to the paysan. And here, with a short quote from Lefebvre that shows why the peasantry, what is typical is this inherence of the workplace, of the house and its surroundings. So what distinguishes peasant life so profoundly from the life of industrial workers even today is precisely this inherence of productive activity in their life in its entirety. The workplace is all around the house. Work is not separated from the everyday life of the family. Starting with this, to investigate the notion of the household, the writings of feminists on social reproduction are crucial. I will not go into much into social reproduction that much. It's a big concept, just to say that it's kind of like a notion that says, like, while stemming from the Marxist analysis of wage labor, we have a big part of work or of activity that is actually not recognized, which is mostly housework, or which is the work that is done to reproduce the worker that he can go into wage labor, and that this work would need also to be called work, and in the very end to be paid. So this is called the housework. So we have here the household defined as a sphere of production and not only consumption, which is an important notion in this work. And going further, we have a lot of feminist and literature about this. And coming to the last term, the subsistence, I quickly want to introduce some writings that I work quite often with, even if you see on the cover, I mean, the titles are not that contemporary anymore, but some of the analyses are quite sharp. So it's about subsistence, and subsistence production is here differently defined than what we had before, because it includes all work that is expended in the creation, recreation, and maintenance of immediate life, and which has no other purpose. So we can also introduce agricultural reproductive work in here. Subsistence production therefore stands in contrast to commodity and surplus value production. And what these writers did, they developed a subsistence perspective, which I use in my work. And they describe the subsistence perspective as a view from below that is anchored in everyday actions. The realization of subsistence perspectives depends primarily not on money, education, status, and prestige, but on control over means of subsistence, a cow, some chicken, children, land, and some independent money income. This means is what is necessary, it's a capacity to reproduce themselves, their lives, without being dependent on outside forces and agents. Going on, we have also some very contemporary literature on that. And also in the 70s, 80s, there is a branch of quite often a bit like techno-critical writers that start to engage researching about work. What is work? How can we label work? And what do we do if wage work always gets less? Like, what is then the other work? And so I want to continue with this graph where these kind of different modulation of the different terms that we just discussed, the peasantry, the household, and the subsistence relate. And they are, in this case, organized around a line of visibility, which is the labor contract. So we see it's called like the iceberg model. So on the top, we have the visible work, which is the wage labor. And below, we have a big chunk of work that is actually done that we don't see. And we have here the housework and women. In this case, for agriculture, it's like the farmer's wife, the peasant's work. We have the peasant's work directed towards subsistence. And we also have people like elderly people, volunteers or children that participate in these peasant works and that we don't really see in official statistics, neither in official views. And this is where I come to the case study, where I'm showing different works and sketches. And these are all observations that I did during regular and repetitive fieldwork visits. This is all the spaces that are, like, let's say the wage labor spaces. They are done, like wage labor in this farm is like household members of the farm collective, because it's a farm collective that leads the farm. Non-family employees, and all together it's distributed on 5 people. But if we look at the work that is on wage labor, it's 50%. So it's the same amount. And in this sketch, we have people working there that is, as said before, relatives such as the elderly, we have children, we have volunteer work, to which I, for example, belong, as they have a CSA, which is a community-supported agriculture system. So you subscribe for a year and you don't pay your products, but I think it's a bit too much to go in now. So we just see that there is a lot of different work there. And what I also want to stress that, like, alone in the moment that I visited, over 15 people, different people were participating in this work. So it's a quite big part of work that is actually taking place there. So we have here an overview of all the work performed. And now I quickly want to go back to the wage labor, because what we see here, it's not clear like what is done with this wage labor. And when we look a bit closer, we see that this is the part of the wage labor, or like of the paid labor that they do, that is directed towards monetary value creation. That means what they sell, vegetables for selling. But there is a big part of work that is done, but it's not directed to the markets, and we can call it subsistence work. And for example, here we have what we know from the feminist analysis, the reproductive work, which is mostly where you eat and you sleep. We have a concept developed by Ivan Illich, shadow work, which is not the subsistence, but it feeds the formal economy, meaning the wage labor. And it means that kind of like, for example, if you need to travel to your job, and this is the lines that you see here on the road, this is time that you have to spend for your job, but you're not paid for it. Or you have taking care, you do the accounting, for example. Accounting is something that is not directly producing an agricultural product, but it's kind of part of the work. And the concept that I found for me the most interesting to work with is called Eigenarbeit in German. In French, it's maybe travail propre à soi. In English, it's no real translation because it's not self-help. And this term designates work whose products you know and perhaps you love or own until you use it for your home community or you sell it. The work whose risk you know and know how to take responsibility for. And Ivan Illich calls this concept developed by Christine von Weizsäcker an active consumption and production renunciation. Thus a work that, that can be a kind of a rupture. And on this farm, we see, for example, one of the blue parts, they use horses. They use horses for working their fields, even though there is no benefit from this at all. It doesn't bring any money. They lose time, they lose work, but like they lose money even, but they do it because they think it's important to have the relation with the horses. Together with the horse, there is the daughter of the one person that always goes in the morning working with the horse. And of course, it's children labor, so it's kind of like, it's a difficult topic to talk about, but it's kind of in her free time, so it's not child labor, I would call it. It's just like volunteer labor of kids that can participate in an action. And also we have, for example, a choir that takes place during the work hours on Wednesday afternoon, organized by a neighbor, to which everyone takes part. So it's kind of like a neighbor proposing a work on the farm, coming there and creating another relation. Or we have regular events with the community, or the father of a farmhand who comes to collect the walnuts, which either are not sold either, but they are kind of commonly shared. And that's where I want to make a link to see all the works supposed, overposed, and the understanding of the history, for example, this contemporary practice allowed me to see this practice in a different way, which is in Vaud in the 19th century. It was mostly done until the 1950s. We have, after the farm slaughter of pigs, which was always done on the farm, the household members and the peasant community members, or like the village members, would come to one's house. Everyone together would crack the nuts while stories and tales were told around. So this is for me a very specific event that I'm interested in, because it has a superimposition of a lot of different kind of works. There is no spatial division of work. And there is, it's like growing out of the single unit of the farm, it's anchored in the territory. And as questions, I want to ask, like, what term in English could be such a household? In French, the writer Geneviève Pruvot has proposed faire maisonner to designate these really precise relations around the common subsistence, which create a lieu très circulant, semi-ouvert, semi-public, or semi-commun. And on the other hand, I would also like to ask the question, like, okay, these relations, how do I show them? Because I'm at the moment not so convinced of the dotting part. So it would be interesting to find ways of really show the superimposition and the relations. Thank you very much. Yes. No, I have 4 case studies at the moment. I decided to not show the location and the place because we are still trying to find out if it's a problem for them, if they, like, officially, it's very complicated in Switzerland. You are officially allowed to have 50% of wage labor on a farm and 50% not. So there is this rule, but at the same time, the farmers were themselves a bit worried if we would show with the location and everything. So we have to find this out in the process, how this will go on.
Yeah, is there a way in which you can speak more about not where they are, but what is for a case study in terms of it has an historical tradition, it's something that just for us to assess the historical constituencies of what you're looking at. I think because of it from the literature that you're mentioning, it's everything extremely stimulating and very precise, and one just wants to connect your case with. Of course, feel free to say as much as you can before you get around.
No, of course. So I choose the case studies. They designate themselves as peasant agriculture. So that's the first thing, which is very important. So they are very precisely located in their, let's say, in their ideology or like philosophy of where they are situated, and also how they work. So all of them are kind of active in organizations. That's also like how I mostly met these people. And the thing is, it's very difficult to talk, or like maybe I say it like this, it's very difficult to talk about typologies of what kind of farm it is, because this also shows literature that very often it's an overlay of different methods of working that can be very, let's say, industrialized, and at the same time you have some subsistence elements. So I think what the case studies have is that they are a big overlay and they're quite messy, all of them. Like when you go there, you feel that there is a lot of things going on, but it's not so easy to understand why and how. Maybe this is explaining a bit.
Yeah, just to insist, I mean, perhaps I think we've mentioned the presentation before, like, is there anything that you can say about how long this has been at place? What's the system of ownership relative to land? Does it have to do with big traditions of inheritance? Is it something that is repurposed?
So all the farms I look at are run by collectives and not farm families anymore. All of them have very difficult legal situations because it's not so easy to access land if you're not a family member in Switzerland. So some of them are also actually accidents. All of them try to find ways of how they own or rent. In this case, it's a by the farm. It's a rental contract of a farm, and in all the cases, they are co-organizers of the farm labor, which means that they don't have a main organizer, and then everyone else is employed by this person. So they try to distribute it. Yes, most of them are organized in a cooperative.
Thank you for your presentation. I found the first topic and content of your dissertation extremely interesting and relevant. I have very few observations, maybe more on the general part, because I agree with Alfredo that in a way, what I found interesting, but at the same time necessity of explanation is that you have a very general introductory part, theoretical ambition in your thesis, but then you have only one case study in Switzerland, which, although it's very interesting, you know, Switzerland is a big peculiar kind of culture in terms of peasantry, very different from others, which is okay, it's not anything bad about it. But I think it's a bit strange that we move from a very general claim, which is very ambitious and rightly so, to just one case study. So I wonder whether this case study, how much this case study can be a paradigm for this kind of very large question that we're putting in front of us. So that would be my first observation. Although, of course, I found the idea that you have a case study that you can visit, that you can work with, that you can live with, is a very strong reason for that. Right? So I think that you have a very strong argument to say, well, I'm focusing on this case. But then I think in the general part, you have to be very careful to argue that kind of passage, let's say, and what is the the specificity of your case study. And then maybe I have a more general comment, which is really on the question of peasantry in relationship to subsistence. I think you need to put this discussion in a more historical perspective, because the concept that looms large in your theoretical part that you never mentioned, but is often contained in many of the books that you show on the screen, is the concept of primitive accumulation, which has a very interesting history, because in the history of Marxism, primitive accumulation was never so important. Also because, for strange reasons, Marx put this concept at the end of Capital Volume 1. And primitive accumulation is really the way in which Marx explained the beginning of capitalism. And basically, the story is that the beginning of capitalism is the dispossession of peasants of their means of production. And so peasants are forced to become wage workers because they don't have any other option basically left. And from then on, peasantry really becomes this kind of history of dispossession. In a way, you can see this history in different countries in Europe. In England starts very early on, but then in other countries like France and Italy arrives later. And the question is, what happened to Switzerland? Switzerland might be one of the, because it's a federal, organization, might be one of the countries that resisted the most to this process of primitive accumulation. France, for example, undergoes the process after the French Revolution. Italy undergoes the process after the unification of the country. The question is, when Switzerland, forms of primitive accumulation start to happen? And I guess that Switzerland has been very resistant to that, not by chance. Switzerland has a strong history of cooperative movements, and which survive even today with the dimension. So if you, I think, describe more this history, I think you might even reinforce the specificity of your case study. Because my guess, but I might be totally wrong, is that Switzerland really has in this history, has played a very interesting and unique role because it's a political history.
Just wanted to pick up on what you said about primitive accumulation. I mean, there's a very interesting book that just came out this year from Alvaro Silva Against the Commons, in which he starts with primitive planning. So he takes Marx's idea of primitive accumulation and thinks about the countryside and talks about it through primitive planning. So, like how that allows for the extension of urbanization across the world, and engages in quite in depth there. But what I like about your method is this sort of like minor history. Like, so I'm a fan, as opposed to an thinker, I'm a fan of minor history, whenever there are these sort of like big Marxist ideas, I'm always like, okay, what about this case which was left out? Why was it the remainder? And that allows us to generatively think of history of capitalism with all sorts of ideas and challenge and push back against some of these big ideas, right? So this sort of like how you sort of appropriate Lefebvre's everyday, like, sort of like a very small aspect from everyday life, the writings on everyday life of Lefebvre, to think about the farm as like, something that's completely surrounding you all the time, and where work and leisure and everyday life is like somehow merged into one. I found it very interesting because it was very formative to his work. He had really relocated to the French countryside to write all these books for these years. And nobody talks about it. No, it's always like, oh, yeah, he wrote from Paris, or he wrote from some city, or this city, or that city. But he was actually a writer of the countryside, writing from the countryside. And what perhaps, and I'm just trying to address your question, which you left us with, is representation. So, I mean, Lefebvre's students were Michel Desserteau and all the situationists in Paris who were developing psychogeography exactly out of, this sort of an understanding of, okay, how to represent everyday life. How do we even like, create a cartography of these fragments of everyday life. And because your cartography was in the end also dots and very like, like representative in a very like, trying to reach very close to reality, that kind of sense, I was wondering if it could be rather a form of like, could you use like fragments as a way, and Colin McFarlane came out with a very interesting book at the end of last year, which is called Fragments of the City, in which he discusses again, how can we do new types of cartography, and how can we sort of really take forth these idea of fragments very seriously. And that's especially useful in your work because you are intentionally talking about, sort of not letting, not exposing your informants, or like not giving away because it's sensitive information, because it has to always be 50-50 work, like which is paid and unpaid. And so could you perhaps then use it more intentionally? I think that would be my instigation. But also to perhaps and that also links to your presentation, to think of planning also from an insurgent perspective. So, not as a top-down thing, but like in John Friedman's way of thinking about planning as, something that comes from the bottom and from the ground. So that would perhaps, link your very interesting ideas of bringing from agrarian studies and from peasantry into planning, and perhaps challenge this, end of peasantry, like this idea which has been so much propagated by Henry Bernstein and all his students, like, 21st century marked the end of peasantry. But you're sort of arguing that peasantry does exist, but you still to show us like, how does it exist. So that would be my answer.
I wanted to quickly comment on the question of representation too, because I think as opposed to the previous project, you also mentioned that you're working with an archive, and you did not show us images yet of the archive. So the question goes a bit, no, for me, interesting historical question there too is like how do actually archives store these processes that really resist the normal media that archives are good at, which is papers with letters and words. Are there other means of representation on how these processes have been archived, and perhaps from there you can either learn or critique how again these forms of practices go through what Hitler refers to as the rhythm, the symbolic. They escape the language that archives normally can hold.
Yeah, it's not common representation.
I think that that's a very good point, and I wanted to contribute a bit on this comment because, first of all, going back to the beginning of your presentation and even to the title of your work, in which you use the words living and working, and then in the beginning of the presentation, you really go back to the concept of peasantry and then family, farm, community, feminism, etc. To me, it feels, since your time frame happens in today, so it's not stopping in the 20th century, but it's really driving up to 2023. I think that it all feels quite human-centered. So for me, it's quite shocking when you talk about living and working and labor, etc. Couldn't it be that you should incorporate a kind of animals or non-humans kind of perspective, animal life and labor, and what are the politics of nature and the economy of animal labor, etc., as extremely contemporary and relevant topics to this research to make it feel more contemporary, basically. So over the last few years, we have seen a massive amount of new terms kind of popping up and be published and disseminated as opposed to the Anthropocene, so Capitalocene, the Plantationocene, the Tudorcene, ecofeminism. Obviously, for me, it's kind of problematic to talk about ecofeminism and not to quote from these terms. So
Yes.
I think that this has to be properly contextualized as of today. And I think that obviously, if we think about the post-human glossary of possibility, etc., I think that in the introduction, very well how she frames that actually post-human theory is very important to question the idea that man is the only representation of human, and to question the idea that human is the center of living life. So I think that this should be addressed in the explanation, and if you decide not to address like a non-human perspective, you should explain why, basically. Otherwise, it just feels 20th century research and not 21st century research. And then coming back to the point that you were mentioning for our media representation, I think that this is pretty helpful. So you are an architect, and therefore now you're doing a PhD, and therefore it comes to the more archetypical forms of media used by architects. And the PhD, which is books, in the beginning of the presentation, we see a massive amount of books, which is fair enough, and we all love theory. And then after that, you move to the plan, which is the dominating means of representation for architects for the last 2,000 years. Okay, and then there is only one photo, and in that photo we don't see animals. Then we only see people around the table. I think that this has to be questioned. Right? So you were referring to the archive. I think over the last few years, 5 to 10 years, like cinema has started to explore massively human emotions through the audiovisual material. So we have seen films as interesting as Bunda by Victor Kosakowski, trying to film the emotions of pigs in a farm and trying to do an animal portrait, not just animals as detached from feelings, but kind of picturesque representation in which they are detached and they become just decoration. And we really try to look animals at the eye, see how they feel, empathize. There was this fantastic film by Andrea Arnold called How, it was released last year. I think it's very telling that Andrea Arnold, a director starting from social kind of cinema, jumps in this kind of non-human kind of cinema. So I think that the fact that cinema is starting to work on that massively is very telling of contemporaneity. And then just to sum it up, I was just thinking like about this, for me that was by John Berger, like, why look at animals? And I remember that is one sentence in this essay that is like, well, I love my pig and I eat my pork. And the fact that the articulation of these two parts is and not bad is very telling of kind of relationship that only happens in peasantry. Like, I love my pig and I eat my pork. So I think that all these questions have to be properly explained and framed, and whether you decide to address them or not, it's your decision, but then you have to make a point. So,
maybe I can quickly take some time to respond to the questions. Yeah, exactly. Like the goal was actually that the first chapter of the thesis is about the household, and the other ones is about animals and plants, and then the last one is not so sure, it's about the trajectory of the good, or like of the thing that actually then leaves the farm. So this was actually planned as a more than human perspective, and I kind of, it's true that like also when I look before the presentation, I actually have like all this also post-humanist bibliography. It's just like for explaining the concepts of the subsistence, which are rooted in the 80s. I think I took it for this presentation, but of course, like Donna Haraway's writings or like also Logan Ting are quite important to understand these entanglements. And I would like to continue with this, but at the same time, I also have still the problematic, as you say, like how to represent it. I only started drawing plants really lately. Before I only wrote, and I had the feeling I must make it visible for myself. Maybe that's because I'm trained as an architect. So this is a good question, like also like what is the work? And I also have to decide for myself, is it really gonna have, let's say, a drawing output, or is it gonna be written work? This is for me also not yet so clear. So I think sometimes a lot of questions. Yes.
Social media.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, quite wide.
I think that it has to be properly
Mhm.
taken as a methodological point. Question like the default mechanism for representation in architecture is why books, what the plan,
Yes.
not all the media.
Well, that's a very good input. Thank you very much. And quickly to the archives, it's a mostly online archive that leads to the specific sources. And it's an archive made by historians, it's in Bern. And their strategy is that because it's very difficult to access what you call the minorities, it's very difficult to access media or like any sources from people that were active in agriculture. So what they mostly did is that they started to do one part of their archive is a person's archive. So you have people and they are related to each other and they have their occupations and their positions. And as a second, you have organizations, because like a lot of the written things comes from organization, and there you can like go then into the organizations sources that are physical. And what I did now, I mean, I worked on the accountability part, and this is from the state, like from the state of Switzerland. But I'm sometimes not so sure how much I should engage with direct source reading or secondary source reading, because I also want to work on the contemporary cases. So this is maybe a question I would have, what your experiences are with this.
Where would the primary? I mean, if you have your command on the secondary literature and then you go and find interesting original material, this will really bring your work. I mean, again, this is me, this person who works on history, but this would put you as an original contributor to that field. And it's not, the archive is not the only means, but of course it's one of them. And when you were mentioning accounting and in another, because for example, when Gideon wrote his chapter on mechanization land, he also observed that there is very little sources on agricultural processes, and he went and looked at patterns. So from the tool, you could extrapolate into. I mean, here we're speaking about, I think, different scales. So perhaps the tool is not something that you would patent. I'm not sure if the patent agency might be the place of your, but the tools I think are interesting here because are the ones that tell you the stories and the information that mediate between the stuff that you cannot really document, how lettuce grow and so on, and what you actually can document, which is accounting. So, and the tool is this like a link, and perhaps there are places where you can find in this it's interesting, but it's if you draw them, they yield they more like your work.
Maybe I just quickly also finish on the other questions. Yeah, thank you very much for the primitive accumulation part. Yeah, of course, it's a big concept. I mean, in general, I try to understand these concepts and I try to work with them, but I also have to admit that it's a very big work. So I tried for me at the moment to kind of like attach where I feel comfortable, but of course, like this whole story of primitive accumulation is quite interesting.
Again, just have the one thing not mentioned before. The reason why I think it is very relevant this concept in your thesis is because the problem of traditional Marxists that always consider primitive accumulation an historical stage that was then, gone because capitalism is industrial. And actually, the people who have brought back the question of pre-accumulation is really feminist things. people like Silvia Federici, but also Maria Mies. She has been really important in arguing that, in fact, we shouldn't call it primitive population, we call it ongoing primitive population. Because it's happening right now. I mean, this kind of process of dispossession of peasants is a phenomenon that is really happening. You know, if you look to the politics of the World Bank or, you know, this kind of international agencies, you know, it's all about that. It's all about forcing communities to rely less and less on subsistence and going into the productive side of the agriculture or cultivation of land. So I think that this is really a struggle that is happening right now. And my question would be, okay, where's Switzerland and the case sits in this struggle? Is it also struggle here, or is it just like, you know, the way in which certain communities are allowed to reproduce themselves? I think that's for me a very, if you use this kind of literature that at the beginning,
Yes.
this is a very militant kind of literature, and they are often questioning, actually. Yes, and Silvia Federici often are questioning this kind of soft attempts to you know, pay lip service to peasantry and agriculture, but then to reproduce patterns that are typical of our global capitalism. So a bit of critique of ideology also of this farming, community farming may be really important because there is a risk today that we are simply putting these things back in the landscape, but then we allow the instrumentalization of these communities for other ends that are, in fact, what we want to criticize, which is basically profit and value creation.
Yes, no, that's a very, I think I will not go into the Swiss context because it's very complicated, but just like for saying we have, compared to the other European countries, a very protective land law, which is taking land, agricultural land out of speculation. But the problem is, like, and this comes to the interesting part, it's bound to family. So it's bound to inheritance. And what we see today is that exactly for the studies that I look at, they are kind of like, they fit this, but at the same time, they don't fit because they're not inheriting very often. And it's a lot of new people that are not from peasant or like farming families that want to go in. So it's a very interesting also tension in Switzerland at the same time that everyone is happy that we have these strong laws, but everyone is also unhappy because it only makes the one operator family farm with his wife who's invisible possible. So it's kind of this very complex situation, but I agree that it's a very specific case. And I think I should hurry up a bit. Sorry. And yes, and about comparisons, I probably will do that. I think comparisons would be important to see the different ones. What I just always face the trouble is, like, I cannot find two same ones. Like, the categories are very difficult because they have so different strategies. So the question for me is very often, like, I have 4, is it enough or not? What do I see? So this is for me still an ongoing question. Like, if there is not a clear farming style, that I also don't want to put these things in, because I think it's important to recognize certain or to also look at certain tendencies, but at the same time, if we put them there, it's also a goal to achieve. And I don't want to say neither that it's a goal to achieve, because several things are also open pathways. And so that's why I sometimes struggle with having very specific cases, because I think they need to be so specific to see these small differences. And at the same time, yeah, if I have too many, what do? I totally understand this question. And thank you very much. And yes, thank you very much also for the input, Nitin. It's the fragmental idea is very nurturing, and it could be a very useful tool to also what you mentioned, to bring it a bit more into the contemporary with this kind of dealing with minorities, how to visualize what is visible but not visible, which takes also more and more, as I work on a thesis, parts the visibility. So I think this is a very interesting input. Thank you very much.
One quick question from the public.
Ah, sorry.
If anybody has one. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, just one question, what you were just saying, what was discussed a lot about representation, and what you were saying, if studies, case studies are specific, does it mean 100 to be statistically significant, and how to draw it. It reminds me of what my supervisor always said, like catching a butterfly and getting it into a box to study its flight, or slicing dead brain cells in order to see how they're thinking. So I think it's the choice of representation that you make is also it determines a lot of what you can find out, and so it's you were saying on all of these farms it's very chaotic and a lot of things are going on, and maybe you should not fall into the trap of trying to categorize it and say, okay, it's 43% of this, and 70 whatever of this, but embrace this scale. Maybe that's what makes it work in the first place, and find a representation that can visualize this.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, not the question.
No, it is true. I was hoping to find maybe something about relations. I'm not sure if it's relations that should be shown, but yeah, we will discuss.
You could have a look at Gillian's relational comparison. Like, so she had a paper on critical economy. She did this really great book on South Africa, and then she came up with this method of relational comparison, where you're not comparing like ideal types or like similar types, but you sort of like drawing relations on comparing cases that might be very like specific. And how do you understand the territorial relations of those relations that are imposed by capitalism? Gillian Hart, she was South African. Her paper is called Relation.